Hello, Stephen FiSHER. How do you do today?
I'm great, Signet. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure and a major honor. I'm going to read to you about Stephen, then we're going to have a, incredible talk that's going to involve some experiential exercises. Uh, so here we go. Stephen FiSHER earned a master's degree in counseling in 1992. He has over 25 years of experience with individual, family, and group counseling with parents, families, adolescents, and children. He also has training and experience in Montessori secondary education. As a counselor and consultant, Stephen has spent the last 25 years helping people and groups to transform their relationships and their lives. He brings a depth of understanding of human communication and human behavior gained through years of training and experience in working to help others improve their lives and relationships. He has worked with individuals, couples, families, groups, and organizations in a variety of settings. Stephen has a wonderful wife, Liz, who works with him as well. And I'm going to read to you about both their dynamic duo right now. Stephen and Liz have been married for over 25 years and live in the Denver, Colorado area. They're my neighbors. They have 3 redhead sons who are in college in Colorado. They enjoy skiing, hiking, biking, and connecting with close friends. They lead seminars and workshops that teach people to dramatically improve the quality of their lives. In their experience, gaining a profound, life-changing self-awareness is not only possible, but it happens all the time. Stephen and Liz teach a process where transforming the quality of your life and relationships happens through fundamentally changing the subjective reality in which you live and operate. Opa, so wonderful. So let's start with you. And what was your point of engagement with this whole subject matter and all these epiphanies that you've had that now you've made into a full-blown process to help people improve everything? How did that come to pass?
Sure. So I always knew ever since I was little that I was going to be a therapist. I just knew that. It was always meaningful to me was actually really talking to people about what was really going on, what we really felt, and what was genuine and authentic. That was always my interest, and I always knew this was what I was going to do. So it was just never a question for me.
Mm-hmm. And I want to point out, having read your book, that you had a bit of a, I don't know what I would liken to a snake bite, because, like some bites can be actually healing.
Yeah.
The poison is actually somewhat of a healing agent. And your father, your relationship with your father particularly seems to have, I would imagine, factored into some of these knowingnesses that you had early on, in part because your father was a very wonderful man, and you see his entirety now and are, fully aware that anything that seemed like a deficit was actually, a gift. And that, but at the time, he was a wonderful man, and still, you as a child didn't feel super connected. Like he didn't make time to sit with you and find out what was going on for you emotionally, and really talk with you. It was all do, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, my dad's solution to every problem was to go to work.
Yeah.
He was a great guy. He was a great man. He loved all of his children and his family, and he's very loyal and dedicated, but he wasn't the kind to talk about his feelings.
Yeah.
He wasn't the kind. The way to connect with him was to do stuff together. And if I wanted his attention, that's what it would have to be. And I always felt like he didn't care.
Yeah.
And of course he did care, but when I was a kid, I didn't know that because his way of expressing his caring was something I didn't understand at the time.
Yeah.
And so so I'm the middle of 7 kids. And he always said to me, he said, "Steve, out of all my 7 kids, you gave me the most trouble."
Yeah.
And I don't think that was because I had a brother who did more quote unquote bad stuff than me, but whenever I had a problem, I was always in his face about it. And he didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
And as a teenager, he and I would argue some. And then when I was as a young adult, I went through some changes, and I realized that his way of loving me was to teach me to work. And him working and him teaching me to work was his way of loving me. Mm-hmm. And so I called him up and I talked to him. I said, "Hey, Dad, I realize now that your way of loving me was to get me to work and teach me to work because that's your value. And I want you to know I never really understood that before." And I really appreciate what you gave me. And first thing he said was, Steve, I've been trying to tell you that for 20 years. That's the first thing he said. We kind of laughed about it, but then he said, he said, I really appreciate you saying that. And what happened is after that, our relationship changed because his walls were up because I was always, as a teenager, coming after him and criticizing him, and he didn't like that. And so once I shifted my perspective to him, suddenly he opened up, and that's when we really did start talking more. He did start giving me more hugs and say that he loved me, and actually tried to be there for me in ways that were more meaningful to me. But I had to stop the blame game. And I think this is one thing in relationships that kills relationships, is the blame game. So the problem is not you, and the problem is not your partner. The problem is how we communicate in a blaming and critical manner. And my relationship with my dad was definitely a very significant and profound change that happened after that. And through all our adult years, he was very much more thoughtful to try to be engaged with me in that way. And he never meant any harm. He was just really busy. He had 7 kids. He was a doctor. He worked all the time. And, that's just where it was. Now, another thing about my dad was he was my first memories are in Ethiopia, and he worked on he brought orthopedics to Ethiopia. And they didn't have orthopedics in Ethiopia. He actually operated, and he pioneered a lot of techniques in leprosy surgery and among other things. And when we left there, we were there for 3 years when I was little. And then when we left there, he enrolled doctors from around the country to become orthopedic, to come to Ethiopia to train the Ethiopian doctors. So now they have orthopedics in Ethiopia because of my dad. So my dad, in a lot of ways, was a great man, but as a teenager, I didn't think he was a great man. He was just this jerk who was always on my back. And the way I perceived him caused his walls to go up, and that created this whole breakdown between me and him that I had to own and take responsibility for. And I wasn't able to do that until I was in my 20s, because as a kid, I just wasn't ready yet.
20s is still early. Go you.
Yeah.
You did
Yeah.
a great job. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about leprosy? I mean, your dad was engaged in big work and looking out for a lot of people. So he was work because he was identified with service. He was like, gosh, so many people to help, so little time. But let's talk about leprosy, because in your book you speak about it, and it has a great allegory nested within it about the purpose of our pain.
Absolutely. So my dad, one of his mentors was a guy named Dr. Paul Brand, who was a doctor, an orthopedic doctor in India, who started a lot of the work on leprosy. And basically, if most people have seen pictures of leprosy, you have your fingers and toes falling off and boils all over. It's really a horrible, horrible disease. But the thing is that leprosy doesn't do any of that. The only thing that leprosy does is that it kills the nerves, so you can't feel any pain. But if you're an African tribesman and you can't feel any pain, you can stick your hand in the fire and it doesn't hurt. They literally wear their fingers and toes off. I mean, on my computer, I have pictures that my dad took of this man literally with half of a foot. He's got bone and muscle and gristle sticking out, and he's walking on it because it doesn't hurt. And so when you don't feel any pain, you basically wear your whole body down. And if you get a cut here and you don't take care of it, it gets infected, and the infection turns to gangrene, and your skin basically dies and rots on your body. So the metaphor here, well, before I get to the metaphor, one other thing that Dr. Paul Brand told, and he has some great books he's written too about, he's got a book called Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants. In that book, he talks about how he would always send his leprosy patients in India home with a cat, because one night, one of his patients woke up and heard some squeaking and looked down, and there was a rat chewing on his leg. Didn't even know it. So they had a lot of rats, so he'd send cats home to protect them from, their bodies get eaten because they didn't feel. So the metaphor here is that if you can't feel your pain, then bad things happen. And what we do, and if you can't feel your emotional pain, bad things happen, because it's not bad. Pain is just information. It's just feedback telling you, oh, don't do that. Bad things are going to happen. And so what we do is we have many coping strategies in our life to not feel pain. We may drink or eat or stay really busy or get involved in activities, a lot of great things, but we do all this oftentimes to not feel what's inside of us. So we're talking about the significance of pain, and as metaphor as leprosy as a metaphor for disconnecting from your pain. So when we disconnect from our pain, we disconnect from an important source of information, because pain is not bad. It's just information telling you, don't do that. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And when we don't pay attention to our pain, then we have all kind of problems in our life, because we're not paying attention to the signals that life is trying to give us about what works and what doesn't work in our life. Because when we have trauma or issues that we've buried and we haven't dealt with, and then we're not responding and we're just kind of ignoring the emotional suffering that we're causing ourselves, then what happens is we continue to make poor choices, and we make those poor choices over and over and over again. I don't know if you've heard of the story where the guy walks down the street, he falls in the pothole, and he can't get out, and somebody has to help him out. And then he walks down the same street, he falls in the pothole, he climbs his way out. And then he walks down the same street, the next day he walks around the pothole, and then the next day he just walks down a different street. That's a lot of people have heard of that. And that's just a metaphor from learning from your life experience. And when we're not paying attention to our pain, not paying attention to our life experience, we're not learning and growing. So I love the metaphor of my dad working with leprosy patients and what he told me about the how pain is the metaphor. And that's a book from Dr. Paul Brand called Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants, is where that whole metaphor was talked about. So anyway, I've loved that whole story.
Yes, so do I. So everybody, I want to mention, and we have an image of Stephen's book, but we have not given it the praise that's due yet. If you look down, you can see on our website, you can click on it and go buy it. However, let's give it a little bit of a moment, and because what we're going to go into is content from his book that is incredibly enriching. Stephen wrote an incredible book called Holding Your Center: Release Ego, Heal Relationships, Reveal Your Authentic Self. And in that book, he brings forth a tremendous process by which to heal one's relationship to self and life and source and relationship itself. So we're going to today actually have some of the experiential processes. We're going to bring some of those forward. But let's first start with, like, where do our relation, let's say, okay, we're in relationship with ourselves always, but with ourselves and with somebody else, because everybody on this is having some experience of relational challenge right now. So if we're having relational challenge with ourselves and others, what is one of the root causes, aside from narratives, what are some of the root causes that get us into these conflicts that just repeat and repeat and repeat?
Right. So the cycles of conflict in our life repeat themselves. Whatever patterns of conflict or conflict avoidance you experienced in your family growing up affects what I call your core fears. The core fears are the fundamental themes of your negative thinking. They can be the themes of what you mentioned, your life narrative. And so we get caught in these fears, and then we act out, and we create these same cycles of conflict or same patterns of conflict. And then we grow up and we leave our family. We create some version of those same patterns as an adult. And when we're unconscious to it and we're not aware of it, and we're not aware of how these things work, we just replay them out over and over again, and we think this is the way it is. We don't realize this is just a pattern we're caught in. It doesn't have to be this way. We think this is the way the world is, or this is the way this is, or this is the way it has to be because, you know, I am powerless, or I'm helpless, or I'm not good enough, therefore I deserve whatever, or I'm alone, or whatever beliefs we have. So we get caught in these same patterns over and over again, and we're replaying it out. I don't know if you've ever heard of ever seen the old movie with Bill Murray called Groundhog Day?
Yes. But
we're just living our own Groundhog Day over and over and over again until we learn how to escape the time loop by really having some healing and making different choices. So we get caught in those same cycles of conflict. And what drives our cycle of conflict is what I call our core fears, or those fundamental themes of our negative self-esteem or negative self-talk. And on some level, for most of us, it's fairly unconscious. We reinforce these negative thoughts, these negative beliefs, and then they outpicture as our coping strategies, our behaviors, are things that we do without realizing, that subtly create the same things to happen over and over and over again. And so what I look at in the book is, how do we understand, one, what our cycles of conflict are, two, what are the coping strategies and behaviors that we have to kind of compensate for that fear-based thinking that we have? And then three, what are the core fears that is driving it all? And the core fears, we make up our own self-esteem messages from when we're little, when we're kids. And we just drag those fears from the past into the present moment. And how do we understand and be with those fears rather than act from those fears?
Mhm.
How do you hold that space of clarity? And this is where the title of the book, Holding Your Center, comes from. How do you learn to hold your center, not only in the face of what others are doing to you or how others are acting or whatever the situations of life are coming at you, but how do you hold your center in the face of your own negative self-talk?
Mhm.
How do you learn to recognize and unplug from all the negative messages going on inside of your head?
Mhm.
Because whatever negative self-talk is going on in your head, that's going to outpicture as the situations in your life, because we're going to subtly act in ways to recreate those same patterns over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so that's the core fears, coping strategies, and cycle of conflict are some of the basic ideas of some of the processes that I use.
Yeah. And let's talk about what, so we you say we, we live in a prison of our own mind, and we're
Right.
always creating our own reality. What is objective reality? You go into these incredibly beautiful, apt descriptors of what actually is outside of all of these core fears and all the ways that we're holding and we're rinsing and repeating. What is the actual truth, the ground of our being?
Sure. So we're all just different aspects of the one experiencing itself from different points of view.
Mhm.
So let me unpack that for a second. So we're all connected, and I'm not here to preach any particular religious belief system, but there is not so much a belief system, but so much a spiritual knowing that we're all connected, that we're all a part of each other in some very real way, that we're all on the same team.
Yes.
And that basically at our fundamental core, people are good. Who we are is good, and who each other is a good thing.
Mhm.
And instead of sitting in that knowing and acting from that knowing, we're acting from all of our fear-based thinking. And then we get caught into all the cycles of conflict. So if we really get back to the core of who we are, we're all connected in a very profound and very wonderful and loving way. But our awareness is not focused on that. We're distracted by all the fear-based thinking on it. But once we get separated from all that and we experience the inner knowing of our goodness and
Mhm.
our ultimate connection with all life around us, then suddenly everything changes. I mean, all the great thinkers in psychology have all had some idea of this as well, that people are good. Every major religion in the world has says some version of the idea that we're all made in God's image, whatever that means. That we all have that core of
Yeah.
divine goodness at our center, and
Right.
whatever that is our nature. That is our birthright.
Mhm.
And whenever what this process is about is getting in touch with that and understanding that and acting from that knowing to create circumstances in your life that work for you,
Mhm.
rather than acting from your fear-based thinking, which creates the opposite.
Yeah.
So all of your thoughts are either based in your fear-based thinking, or they're coming from your basic awareness that who you are is all about love.
Yes.
And you're either in one paradigm or the other at any given moment. And holding your center is learning how to hold yourself in that knowing that who you are is a good person. Who you are is that divine center of goodness is your nature.
Mhm.
And holding that knowing in the face of whatever circumstances come your way externally, whatever relationship conflicts, and whatever negative self-talk you have going on inside your head, holding your center and holding that knowing in the face of no matter what happens actually trains you to be more effective in dealing with life's challenges. And
Mhm.
people say, well, I think I need my fears to protect myself. I don't think so.
Mhm.
I, I think the fears you have can have some functionality in certain situations, but what they do is they lock our brain up and they get us into a lot of dysfunctional tracks of behaving and thinking that don't really work in the long run.
They block
So
our intuitive signals that can actually help keep us safe in the moment, no matter what's going on. Because when we're
absolutely.
present with remembering that person's divinity, no matter what they're doing, remembering our own, no matter what's happened in our lives and no matter what we've done, it clears the way for our other faculties to actually work because we're not shut down in fight, flight, freeze. In fight, fight, freeze, you can't do anything but fight, flee, or freeze or
Right.
flirt. Some people say flirt too, but you know, but
Right.
if you actually are centered and present, like a couple allegories that you give in the book that are so powerful come to mind. ZZ Top and the samurai. I don't
Yeah,
know if it's an actual samurai, but heaven and hell. Maybe we can reference those because I think those are powerful depictors of what we're speaking about.
absolutely. So in the samurai story, a man in Japan goes to the top of the mountain, a samurai goes to the top of the mountain to visit the wise master. And he asked, he gets there and the man sitting on his little rock, and he asked the master, tell me about heaven and hell. And the old man, he looks at the samurai and he says, your mother's a prostitute and your family's all pigs. And he starts insulting him. And they knew back in that time that if you insulted a samurai, they would kill you. And he kept on insulting the samurai until the samurai was just filled with rage. And he got his sword out and he's about to chop the guy's head off. And in that moment, the wise master said, that is hell. And the samurai realized that the old master was literally risked his life to teach him this lesson. And he felt so grateful. He felt deeply moved that the man would risk everything just to teach him this lesson. And he fell at his feet and said, thank you, master. And he felt such deep love and gratitude in that moment. And the master said, that is heaven. And at any given moment, we put ourselves in heaven and hell, because heaven is not necessarily a time or a place. It's a state of being. It's a state of mind where you sense and feel the love and the connection around you. Now, I want to be clear. This is not just rainbows and unicorns and ponies in an unpractical, ungrounded way. This is eminently practical and usable, because when you're in your fear and your fight or flight, you get less effective in taking care of yourself. When you're in your joy and in your love and in your intuition, your inner knowing, the brain is the most advanced piece of equipment in the galaxy, but you can't use it properly. You can't use your intuition properly when your brain is locked up in fear, just like you said earlier. But when you're in that center place and everything calms and your higher functions kick in, your brain works better and you just make better choices. So what protects you is your good judgment and healthy boundaries, not anger and fear and all that negative thinking. So that's the samurai story. And I love the ZZ Top story, but I'm going to keep that as a teaser for people. But by the way, I love the ZZ Top story, and maybe we'll get to it later in the interview. There's another story I'd like to maybe revisit that's similar. So years ago, I was in therapy with a little 9-year-old boy. We're in the playroom at the institution where I worked. And he came in and he told me that his dad had just gotten put in jail for dealing crack cocaine. And he was just really, really sad about it. And so I had him draw his dad behind bars there in the playroom, and he did. And he sat in front of that picture. And he must have cried for 30 minutes straight, like deep, racking, boo-hooing sobs. And in that moment, there was nothing for me to do except just to be with him and let his pain come up. And that's what I call the gift of nothing. No judgments, no expectations, not trying to put a trip, just letting people be with their pain without reacting to it, without trying to fix it, without trying to give him some food or make him feel better, just to be in nothing. And he cried for 30 minutes, and then he went home. And then next week, when his mom brought him back, she said, I don't know what you did, but keep doing it because he's getting better now. Because in that moment, there was something between that beautiful little boy and I that our souls touched. And there was something that happened in that moment where we just felt that sense of love and connection and goodness and oneness, that you get back to that healing moment and everything shifts. And so the processes I'm using is about how do you remove all the baggage we have so you can get back to that healing moment. And that's not about trying to create or manifest anything. That's about removing all the ego baggage and all the perceptual filters and all the fear-based thinking, and just let the moment be what it is without putting anything else on it, being fully present. And when you're there in nothing, no judgments, no expectations, then something happens. Then our connection at a soul level comes forward and some healing happens. And so what I'm about is how do we create that healing moment over and over and over again in our relationships, in our lives, in the different situations, the different challenges in our life. And it's all some form of fear-based thinking that's holding us back. So how do we recognize it? How do we start to systematically dismantle it in our psyches? And how do we unplug from it so we can just be fully present in the moment and let our own inner guidance, our own intuition guide us more fully, because it'll always lead you better than your ego ever will.
Mhm. You know,
So
I hear a lot of people, I just, having lived and spoken with people, and there are a lot of people who are very circumspect of believing that somehow their childhood weighs into the results that they're getting in their now and their relationships, etc. But I do want to point out, related to what you're saying, every moment is either a healing moment or a hurting moment. It's when
right,
we're children and we don't have these skills and we don't have these tools. Some of our families bring some things to bear, so maybe we're a little farther along, or we bring it from a past life sometimes, or whatever. But even still, in one's relationship now, are you having a challenge? Did you once upon a time have a great time with your partner, and now are you having challenges? Well, if
right,
so, what happened? There was a lot of rinsing and repeating of painful moments that were not handled
absolutely.
in a way. And so your entire childhood, I mean, how long have you been with your partner? Your childhood most often the number of years outnumbers the amount of time that you've been with your partner many times. And so you can see how easily, and really those patterns that are coming forward in relationship are the same patterns from our childhood. We're bringing them,
Absolutely.
and that's why they get triggered so quickly, because they got primed all that time ago for such a long time. So
Absolutely. And
yeah.
those patterns are hanging out in our subconscious, just waiting for a chance to express themselves, waiting for a chance to reassert, because we're always trying to reenact those old patterns of dysfunction so we can get it right this time, so we can heal this time, so we can figure it out and then move forward.
Yes.
People think, well, why do I got to recreate all trauma of my past? Well, you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to heal it. That's why you have to do it. It's not a bad thing. It's just part of the individuation process.
Yeah, and it's bringing us back to our source. It's bringing us back to our inherent nature, which is what we described before. We're all interrelated. There's love everywhere within all of us, and between all of us, and we can have soulmates everywhere. We can have connections with everyone everywhere. There isn't just one person that we are destined to connect with.
Right.
We can have that kind of love
Right.
flowing between us to greater and lesser degrees based on how long we're around people and what their capacity is, but we can always be flowing that and knowing that, and that is our essential nature. um
Absolutely.
yeah. So there was something I was going to say. uh oh,
Are
I
you
wanted
okay?
to, yeah, yeah,
Are you okay? Back to that ZZ Top story really quick.
yes, bring it.
Because I actually, as you mentioned it, I was like, no, I actually really do need to talk about that one.
Mm,
So, um, so I want to start with a different story that leads into that story. So the first story is the one I call the puppy poo-poo story,
mhm,
where when I was first married to my wife Liz, we had an apartment for our first 6 months, and then we were going to buy our first house. And there was a couple months gap between the apartment lease being up and our house being. So one of the places we lived in that time was in the room above my parents' kitchen.
mhm,
They had a big blue log cabin back then. And so we had a puppy. And one day my mom came to me. She said, "Steve, would you put the puppy in the cage? You got the realtors come over. We're trying to sell the house." I said, "Sure." And so we I didn't think about it later until it was Sunday after lunch. She came up to me. She said, "Steve, you forgot to put the puppy in the cage." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah." And the puppy pooped at the top of the stairs. I said, "Really? I'm sorry." She said, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah." And me and 30 realtors had to step over a pile of dog poo. And now I can tell she's pissed. And her eyes are flashing red. And I'm like, "Oh no, here we go." And she proceeded to launch into me and to let me know how upset she was and how selfish and how was this. And she just really was completely got angry and just went off full blast for me for about 5 minutes. And this was the story of my life with my mom. And the story was something like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You know that story, that part of the story where she's at the castle of the Wicked Witch of the West, and the
yes.
Wicked Witch is coming up. There are all the flying monkeys around, which is like, "I'll get you my pretty little dog too." That was the story or narrative of my life with my mom, because she's always getting pissed, and I was always feeling really helpless and powerless, and help, and taking hurt.
Mhm,
And powerless to do anything about it.
Mhm.
But in that moment, I first of all knew how to fight back, because during my teenage years, we fought like cats and dogs. When I was a kid, I'd run away from it. So I knew how to fight or flight. I
Mhm.
didn't know how to just be in the face of it without reacting.
Mhm.
But in that moment, for whatever reason, I did. And I was just listening to her talk, and I was realizing that I was looking at what was mine and what was not mine. And out of all that, what was mine was I let the dog upstairs, put them on the floor as my responsibilities. My account, I did that. I took accountability for that. But all of her anger, all of her vitriol, and all of her hatred in that moment was not mine. That was hers. And I was just so clear on that. And I wasn't even mad at her about that. I was just able to listen and be with her. I took accountability for what I did, but the rest of it would just pass right through me. And then how my mom used to like to end her tirades was to make some big pronouncement of everything is all screwed up, and she would storm out, which is what she did.
Mhm.
But a couple days later, she came back to me, because I wasn't mad at her. I wasn't upset. I wasn't feeding into it. I was just calm. I was in nothing. I was at peace. She came back to me. She said, Steve, I guess if I'm still doing that to you, I haven't come as far as I thought. I'm sorry. Now, my mom was not an apologizer, but this time she really did. And I think the reason she did was because I wasn't reactive to it. I wasn't going into fight or flight. I took ownership of my part, but I didn't hit back. I didn't give her negativity back. I was just holding my center. And everything shifted. And after that moment, I just was never scared of my mom anymore.
That's awesome.
And for the rest of our adult lives, we actually had a much improved relationship. So the reason I tell that story, because it's about holding your center. Now we pop forward a few years, and I'm at a ZZ Top concert. One of my favorite bands, by the way.
Yes.
And Billy Gibbons is up front and out. I'm in my happy place, and there's this fight breaks out about 20 yards over, and they're just like 20, 30 guys all getting after it. And it's getting closer and closer to me. And I look over, as soon as I look over, because I'm just in the music, I'm just in my happy place, I'm not paying attention, but I look over, and there's this guy fighting somebody over here, and he turns around, he comes at me, and his fist is right here. And for whatever reason, I'm still in my happy place with the music. My brain is full of alpha waves just cascading through it. I'm just like looking at him. I'm calm. I'm holding my center. I'm not reacting to him. Now, I'm not against defending myself, but in that moment, that's not what I did. I was just calmly looking at him while his fist was coming at my face. And when his fist was that far, he finally looked at me. He saw I wasn't fighting back. I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't fighting back. And he froze. And he looked at me dead in the eye. And his body was whole charged with all this fight energy. And he gave me this big old grin. And our eyes made this intense, powerful connection. In that moment, we experienced our oneness. And then he turned and he went to fight somebody else.
That is so incredible.
That's exactly what happened, because I didn't react. And that was the same thing that happened with my mom, because I didn't react. And that's where the title of the book, Holding Your Center, comes from.
Yeah.
How can you hold your center in the face of life's challenges and bring the best of yourself forward to meet the situation, rather than all your fear-based thinking and reactive stuff?
Yeah.
And every time you do that, situations that you thought were intractable and unsolvable become transformed and healed in some amazing way you can't even imagine.
Yes. I love how, the gift of nothing is similar, related to the empty cup, which is what you
Yes.
speak about. And you did empty cup with your mom. And I love, you were holding your center, but you were also an empty cup for her, so that she could put her contents, all of her stuff, into the cup. And it's like you were actually holding for her as well, but not in a way where
Yes.
you were pointing finger at yourself. You were just there with the space so that she could. And being a woman, I love the notion. I mean, just being held feels so well, being received by being
Yes.
held. So by doing that, it made room for her to find her center, because she got to see everything that was in the cup, be with it. And I love thinking about it. A lot of things that we drink from cups are like healing elixirs, like tea, and so
Sure.
it's like she's able to be with her content, without judgment, recrimination, blame, anything coming from the outside.
Yes,
And then by doing that, it becomes a medicinal elixir where she can actually become aware of what she has been holding and what she's been having to go through and what hasn't been moving. So it's able to move
absolutely.
when she sees it. So
Absolutely. When you can hold that space for another person,
yeah,
it's the metaphor is the empty cup. Like your cup's not full of all your issues. You're to really empty your cup of all your issues. Let them put their stuff without your judgments or criticisms. It does create that space where healing can happen,
yes.
where people can self-reflect because they don't feel judged, they don't feel criticized, and they feel safe.
Yes.
When
And it's
people feel
also
safe,
totally, and it's also another thing that you talk about throughout the book, which we've referenced, when you're holding that space and empty vesseling and giving the gift of nothing, you you are inherently in touch with your own divinity and I mean, non-religious, but just our oneness, our
mhm,
majesty and our love. And by holding this love vessel for yourself and for someone else, that is so medicinal. It brings it remind somebody of their love. So,
absolutely,
you're not just being,
absolutely,
because I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, I was non-reactive and I just didn't care what they were saying and I just sat there and it moved through." But that's very qualitatively different than actually
yes,
holding the space for love. And
it
that is
is,
what we're also suffusing this nothingness with. It's not even suffusing, it's just the inherent beingness, and it's allowing that beingness to be there.
right.
So,
When you're in that space of nothing, you're also in touch with everything.
yes, yes.
And it is the heart of the transformation process. It is the heart of the counseling process.
Yeah.
All the other processes that are used are to help people get to that place of nothing,
Mm,
and where you're just at center, you're at one, you're at peace. And when you can be there, and you can be there in the face of whatever life challenges knocked you off your horse before,
yeah.
then whatever those challenges are can resolve when you learn how to hold your center in the face of them
Mhm.
and be in that space of nothing. So all the talk about the core fears, coping strategies, cycle of conflict, understanding the programming of all your ego baggage, all of that is to help you get back to the place of nothing, because the ego fears keep you from being in that place of nothing. They keep you in this reactive place that just keeps that cycle of conflict going. Being in nothing erases it all and makes a, a space for a new possibility to occur.
Uh, so I'm thinking about blame and how you frame blame. I mean, it's true, but you say in the book that it's not somebody else, it's not us, it's how we are interacting with the blame game. Maybe we can talk a
Yes.
little. We've been talking about blame, and people know what that is, but let's geek out on blame for a moment.
Absolutely. And I use that phrase in couples therapy a lot,
Mm,
or in families where they're blaming each other. So in relationship conflict, it's not you and it's not the other person that's a problem. It's how we communicate in a blaming and critical manner. Because once one person, if you ever heard that phrase, whenever you point the finger at somebody, three fingers are pointing back at you. Because whenever we blame, people blame us back. And it creates this whole thing going on that distracts us from the truth.
we just get caught up, and it's like a Nash fest, and we just get caught up, and it usually doesn't move through.
Right,
It hangs and just repeats.
right. And today's time and age, when in today's day and age, when our politics are so divisive and they're so difficult right now, and people on either side feel very mistrustful of the other side.
Mhm.
But whatever belief system you have, whatever your political leanings are, there's still good people on both sides of the aisle. And if we can put aside our beliefs about things to see the goodness of the other person in front of us,
Mhm.
suddenly the conversation can transform as well.
Yes.
So this applies on many, many, many levels.
Mhm. I was very moved in your book by Amy and Joel's, or I don't know if you say Joel or Joel, but
Yeah.
their
Oh,
story. I was reading that and I thought, wow, this is like, I don't know, 20-ish paragraphs, something like that. Nothing huge, but in today's day and age, people's attention spans, 20 paragraphs of kind of a narrative can shut people down. I happen to have an attention span forever, and I remember back when it wasn't so much like how it is now. But I was reading that and I was like, it takes that kind of attention span in a relationship breakdown, some sort of calamity that's
yeah.
like really causing the relationship to almost be, I mean, on its way out, um,
Right.
to actually get through it. And I want to introduce, these are simple principles that you bring forward. And anyone can carry them through. Anybody can do the self-reflection. Anybody can do the showing up and not blaming, all of that. And yet they do have to operate in concert, and it is a skills acquisition process. And there
Yep.
is a certain amount of devotion that you have to bring to it and a stick-to-itiveness in order to see your way through to the other side.
Mhm.
I want to bring forward like the example of let's bring forward. I mean, I don't know, we could bring forward Amy and Joel, whomever you want, but let's pretend like a couple is coming in that is having a challenge. Let's
Yes.
give them like kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end of, to the resolution and what that requires. Like if we were to say, okay, we want to get through what we're having go on, let's use these processes and get to the other side.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when couples come in, there's almost always the blame game going on,
Mhm.
and they have a lot of grievance about why the other person is wrong or bad or what they're doing.
Mhm.
And so we'll start off with, first of all, the empty cup, which is a metaphor for that space of non-judgmental awareness where you're just listening to each other. And I'll teach them the skill of active listening,
Mhm.
where instead of saying, when your partner says something, instead of saying your point back, just paraphrase back what they said,
Yeah.
which is like a basic counseling skill to really listen.
Mhm.
And can you reflect back what your partner's saying without judging, without criticizing, without sarcasm, but really trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes?
Mhm.
Walk a mile in the other person's shoes for a minute to see it from their point of view. Agreement is not necessary. You don't have to agree with your partner, but if you can just understand from their point of view, and even if they're saying horrible things about you or calling you names, can you at least understand why they're upset and what their point is?
Mhm.
And then so we go through the active listening process to hear each other's point of view.
Mhm.
Step one,
Mhm.
just to hear each other out, listen, because whenever arguments and the blame game starts, listening is the first thing that stops.
Mhm.
How do we put that back? Now, a couple, what you might call
Yeah.
contraindications, which means like, when is active listening not helpful?
Mhm.
So if people are just wanting to have an axe to grind and they have an agenda, they don't really want to resolve things, they just want to dominate.
Yeah.
And active listening may not be the best thing in that moment.
Mhm.
You might need to set some boundaries. Like healthy boundaries is really, really important. Learning how to say no. Hey, when we can talk respectfully, I'd love to listen. So
Mhm.
having some boundaries around people who are just wanting to dominate or having another agenda.
Yeah.
But if we can get through that part, and there's two people that really want to sort through this,
Mhm.
active listening is a really critical step to really hear each other out.
Right.
And then from there, how do we make agreements? How do we have ownership of our stuff?
Mhm.
Like in the Amy and Joel story, there are some very, serious relationship problems, serious issues that would break up most relationships that that Joel had to take ownership of.
Mhm.
But also too, Amy had to take ownership of her part too, because there's blame on both sides. One partner may think, well, I didn't do anything. Why am I? But if that partner is playing the victim and feeling victimized, and then they use that victimization as a way to beat their partner over the head with, that's just as toxic, even if they didn't do any bad behaviors, quote unquote,
Right.
like cheating or stuff like that
Yes.
happened in that story.
Yes.
So when both people can own responsibility for their issues, for their fears, and for their triggers. We'll talk about the cycle of conflict. What are the patterns of conflict or conflict avoidance they're having? Where does that come from in their life history with their families growing up? How are they blaming themselves or others? What are their core fears? What are their coping strategies? And so we'll learn all those pieces of it, and then they can start to learn to communicate in an emotionally clean manner.
Mhm.
Hey, when you did this, I was really upset.
Mhm.
And this is what got triggered for me. These are my core wounds that got triggered for me when you did this, as opposed to you're a horrible monster because you did A, B, and C.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because we're all subtly criticizing and we want to make the other person responsible for our feelings. And if we can all own 100% responsibility for our feelings, and this is another foundation of the counseling and therapeutic process of transformation, is owning 100% responsibility for how you perceive, how you interpret reality, and how you are interacting with the other person, because how you interact has a profound impact on how they interact with you. So a good relationship is not 50-50, it's 100-100,
Yeah.
because however you act has 100% impact on the cycle of conflict and the dynamics between you two. And so this is the fundamental truth of family therapy, of the dynamic of our interaction. Now, the fundamental truth of cognitive therapy is our own core fears create our own reality. And so we're blending the truths of some of these schools of thought and psychology in a way where people can fully own responsibility for their reality, for the way they perceive it, learn not to play the blame game for their feelings, but also take ownership of how their behavior impacts the people around them, the dynamics of conflict. So we'll go through all these things in as a couple. There's a psychoeducation, a training process, teaching people how to really take responsibility instead of playing blame game. How do you look at what your core fears are? How do you take responsibility for your core fears instead of blaming your partner for your fear-based thinking? Because whatever baggage you had it before you met your partner. You just dragged all that baggage from the past into the present moment, creating your own little Groundhog Day. And so how do we own up to all that? And that frees us from the blame game, so we can communicate in an emotionally clean way. When we do that, everything starts to change. When people communicate without the blame game, everything starts to shift. People take accountability. You can make agreements. You can actually have accountability in a way that actually people feel empowered by, not criticized and put down by. And so these are just some elements of the counseling process that we'll bring into it with every single couple. We walk through these same steps over and over and over again. So that's a general idea of how some of that works. I hope that answered your question.
Oh,
Okay.
it totally does. Can we give an example of a self-responsible interaction? I can think of one in the book between you and your wife at the Irish pub. I loved how that went, because I think that's a very common occurrence for a lot of people. I would love to depict for them how situations like that can unfold in a way that actually brings you closer instead
Absolutely.
of bringing you farther apart. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll just use that story because it's a great, I love that story too.
Yeah.
So me and my wife, it was a Friday night. We were at an Irish pub in our neighborhood. Love that place. And they were slammed and they were really busy. And the waitress was taking our order and rushing off because she had and so what I started doing was I was just starting to, she was kind of ignoring us. So I was trying to engage her, and I was trying to get something going here. I was kind of making some jokes, and I was just trying to, get something attention going here, because she was just kind of ignoring us and rushing off.
Yeah.
And after about 5 minutes of this, my wife was like, Steve, what's going on here? I mean, she's clearly busy. Why are you being so hard trying to get her attention when she's busy and you're here with me on a date? What am I, chopped liver? I mean, what's going on here? And I easily could have gone in defensive mode. I easily could have said, what are you doing? Why are you blaming me? I'm not doing anything. I could have gone into all those things, but I was really looking and thinking, because my wife and I, we actually practice this stuff. And this is not just something we talk about. We actually try to live by it. And I was looking at it, and I was like, that's interesting. Why was I doing that? I was just curious. And as I looked, what I saw was my abandonment issues got triggered. Here was somebody who was engaging, but kind of ignoring us. And so that triggered all of my abandonment issues. And so when my abandonment issues got triggered, I unconsciously went into my coping strategies, which was a couple things. One, try to make jokes or get attention, or try to, get something going. And I was just doing this whole thing and had no idea I was even doing it. All my unconscious patterns had gotten engaged. And to my wife's credit, instead of criticizing me, she just asked a question in a pretty neutral manner. And because we're working on this stuff, I was like, And then we had a whole big conversation about my abandonment issues getting triggered, about what that triggered for her. And we had this whole intimate moment. And then it was just, it's gone. Yeah. And then we had this beautiful night together. But and this is how relationships can remind us and bring us to healing and wholeness, is there's nobody else on the planet that you have as much interaction with as your partner. Nobody else is going to get triggered and trigger all of your issues as deeply as your partner will. And that is actually, can be painful, but it's actually an opportunity to really have a self-awareness and to heal and to grow and to learn from each other rather than beat each other up. Yeah. And when you do that, relationships become a vehicle for wholeness. Like when I was a teenager and a young adult, I had this fantasy of going off to live on some mountain in Tibet and meditate and find God. And what I've learned is that I have found so much growth, and I found spirit in my relationship with my wife, with my kids. and the responsibilities of being a husband and a father.
Yes.
When I go to buy groceries at the Safeway, having a playful conversation, there's so much joy to be had right here. I didn't have to go on some mountain to Tibet to find it, but I had to really give myself to those moments, like in the Irish pub, or those moments that feel hard when me and my wife are cross swords, or my kids need so much from me, or life happens, or it just goes on. When those moments, when I can use those moments to self-reflect and look at what my triggers and fears are, and then practice releasing them and practice making better choices in the moment, rather than letting my fear-based thinking take over. And this takes us to another part of the counseling process, which is what I call the 3-step process.
Yeah.
And the first step is self-awareness of all these core fears and all these triggers happening in your head. Just self-awareness. Take your focus off of all these things around you and the other person, the blame game, whatever else, and put it in here. And what you'll notice is what I call the usual suspects, all those same themes of your fear-based thinking happening over and over again. And once you do, that's an aha moment. Oh, that's happening again. My abandonment issues got triggered, and therefore I'm acting this way. Got it. Okay. Release that. Breathe. I'm a good person. Now I'm centered. Now I'm focused on the core truth of love at my core. That's the second step, is to unplug from all your fear-based thinking and just be present. And then the third step is just make good choices. Because when your head's all jacked up on your core fears, you're going to make poor choices. It is not going to go well.
Right.
But when you take a moment, you recognize and unplug from your fears, and you tune into your intuition, your inner knowing, suddenly the best part of you is come forward. You're automatically going to start making better choices, and things will tend to work out better. I'm not going to promise you that every single time it'll be perfect, but statistically speaking, things will go better when you're coming from your intuition and your inner knowing rather than your fear-based thinking. When you do that, your life situations start to resolve, things start to work better, and your life heads in a better direction, and you're spiritually growing in the process as well. And I will say that I'm so glad I made the choice of the path I did, because it has been such a powerful path of spiritual growth that I don't think I would have had on some mountain in Tibet somewhere.
It comes up for me when you were getting through some of your core wounds initially in your life. You had a girlfriend that was going to be your wife, and that didn't work out. I would love to give the example of how sometimes really all the time, we need to be our own empty cup as well. I liken that your process there, and maybe you can just speak to that. What were the constituent pieces that helped you to get through these really deep-seated core wounds and clear your space so that you could go on to create a really beautiful life, meet a wonderful woman that could meet you so well? That's
absolutely. And thank you for asking. So in growing up in my family of origin, I protected myself by having a lot of walls. And emotional, like vulnerability, emotional intimacy was just not possible for me, because the way I protected myself from, sarcasm or issues in my family was to basically have this kind of a wall of iron around me that protected me from my emotions, but I also kept myself from emotional vulnerability and intimacy, and really deeply being able to express my pain or express my fears, or really to share that with people. And so when my first love in high school was Anna, and we have those moments where your eyes meet and something happens. That absolutely happened. And then we dated off and on through high school, through college, dated some other people, come back summers and Christmases. And then after college, we got together and we were engaged to be married. And a couple months before the wedding, we called it off, because I just knew it wasn't right, because I was very much an introvert and I couldn't just open up, and she was very much an extrovert. And I was kind of like dependent on that to reach me. Like she could just kind of step in my walls and just reach me. And so we had this kind of codependency thing while we really deeply loved each other. And she's an amazing, wonderful person. We had these patterns that we knew weren't right for us. And so we had the flowers were all ordered. The invitations were printed up. As 2 months before the wedding. I was 24 years old, and we called it off because we just knew it was the right thing, even though we deeply loved each other. And then I didn't even think about it. She left, I left. I dated somebody else. I dated in college for a little while. But 9 months later, when about the time it takes for a baby to be born and gestated, something happened in my consciousness where I just started, well, I'd heard that she was dating somebody else. And I was driving back into town one afternoon, and I just knew she was with her new boyfriend. And for some reason, all this jealousy hit me. And it's almost like she was my soulmate. And I felt me and her had this soul connection. And I was just upset. I'd heard to the grapevine she was dating somebody else in my business, but for some reason, we'd said goodbye, but I'd never fully let her go. Yeah. And so what happened was I started calling her all night long and then all weekend long. And it was just really like, and we even met for breakfast a couple times. But even when we did that on Saturday morning and Sunday morning again, I couldn't tell her how I felt because I could not be vulnerable. Wow. Couldn't let my walls down. I couldn't share my feelings. I could not do that because it was against my conditioning. And so we left and, but what happened was Monday morning, I was a wreck. I had this whole horrible weekend. She was, at the weekend with her boyfriend. And I didn't like it. And I was upset by it. But I still couldn't reach out and tell her how I felt because I couldn't be vulnerable. And so Monday morning, and this is actually, I didn't put this in the book because I felt there might be a little bit much. But Monday morning, my whole emotional system was a wreck. Because here's my soulmate dating somebody else. And I was really bent out of shape about it. And so I decided I'm going to go get blood Monday morning, which is what I do. I go get blood, and I haven't had eaten in like 2 or 3 days. I'm an emotional wreck. And so I stand up from giving blood. I take 2 steps and I fall out and I pass out and have a small seizure. I've never had one before or since. And what they said was my fingers were doing this. It's almost like I was saying, Anna, come back and back and back and back and back. But there came a moment when the seizure just stopped. And to me, that was the moment when I let her go because I was hanging on to it every single bit of energy I had in it. At that moment, I just had nothing left. Before that moment, I was jealous, I was angry, I was hurt, but I couldn't cry. When I woke up, of course, they're worried, don't give me more blood, here's some juice and cookies, go out the back door, don't scare all the other customers. But when I get home, I start to cry. And I had this deep, deep, deep grief. And I was grieving the loss of Anna, but I was also grieving the loss of all the loneliness of my past, my childhood that I thought Anna could save me from. Really, no other person can save you from what's inside of you. And so I was grieving the loss of Anna, but I was also grieving the loss of all of my history of loneliness. And for a whole month, they say the body's 80% water. I must have wrung it out more than once. And I'd be crying at weird times. And whenever at night the sun would go down, I think, oh my God, she's with her boyfriend. And instead of calling and trying to fix it, I would just like be with it. And I'm like, oh, the angst of that, the angst of my soulmate being with somebody else, even though I'd said goodbye, was still hard, but I just breathe through it. And then I'd be crying at odd times. Like I would be sit with my brother's girlfriend on my porch steps and just start breaking down. I was with my minister at one point, just cried like a baby in his arms. I was actually riding somewhere in the back of my car. My mom and dad just start crying. In odd places, just that month of grief. But through that hard month of hard grief, what happened was I learned to express my feelings and I learned to reach out, and people were there for me in a way that they'd never been before because I'd never let them. It's not that they didn't want to. I had never reached out like that before. And when I did and they were there for me, it actually helped me go back and redo. I don't know if you're familiar with Erik Erikson, stages of development, but one of his early stages was trust versus mistrust when you're an infant. And say, I don't think I quite made it fully through that stage because I didn't trust people. But going through that grief and that deep feeling and reaching out to people, it's almost like I've learned to trust people. I learned to reach out and be vulnerable. That's when I kind of moved on from there, and I started to move into the counseling and psychology world, and I started moving to a professional career because one of the reasons we broke up when I was 24 because I wasn't ready to grow up. I was just Peter Pan. Yeah. And that's what made me ready to be able to have the relationship I have today with my wife. Because if I hadn't, that cracked my heart open, and it needed to be cracked open. That loss was one of the most painful and one of the best things that ever happened to me. And then since then, I've been through that transformation process many, many times. But that first time, it was just so painful because I fought it so hard and I was just so scared. But once you go through it, and you can go through it again and again and again, and you get a little more trust for the process, that even though it's scary and challenging, It's just challenging your ego.
Yeah.
And you're just hanging on to stuff that's not really you. And all you have to let go of the stuff you never needed in the first place. And the more I go through this process, the easier and easier it is to trust the process and to let whatever is trying to happen evolve, let it happen. But that part with Anna is what really cracked my heart up and made me ready to have the relationship I have with Liz today. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for that experience and for her as well.
Yeah. So I love highlighting that you really do have to allow yourself to be your full self, including the so-called warts and all. Grief is actually a huge friend. It's an assist. And it's
Absolutely.
not a wart, but everybody looks at it as though it's a wart. And
Right.
so can we, I would love to talk about that. We've already referenced it, but I'd love to zoom in on it some. There is a difference between, okay, I want to be an empty vessel because I want to foster the best between myself and my love. And there is a point where you said we need to instate a boundary sometimes. What
Yes.
would be some reasons why we would need to instate a boundary? And how can, you have already referenced it, but let's just again, zoom in and put a good frame around it.
Mm-hmm.
How do we handle that? How do we get to the other side of it? How do we schedule something when the person is not behaving this way? What are the deal breakers of that moment?
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, your mom was impugning you and I don't know if she was calling you names, but she was saying, you don't do this, you never do that. Yeah, she was talking in kind of those gnashy, always never, something's wrong with you type of ways. How do we
Right.
know when it's time to have a boundary with when somebody's saying stuff to us that we want to be there as an empty vessel, but it's too painful, or what they're doing is a boundary is abusive or whatever?
Right. So a couple things. First is it's important to know your own limitations. So if you're able to hold your center and truly not take something personally, you don't need the boundary because the boundary is there to protect you.
Yeah.
But ultimately what it's protecting is ultimately your ego. Because when you're in your divine nature, you don't need any protection. There's nothing that really ultimately can hurt you because you know your goodness and your oneness regardless. So we set up boundaries because we feel scared, we threaten, we know we've reached the edge of what we can do. And so we need to set a boundary. And in that situation with me and my mom and the puppy poo-poo story, for whatever reason, I just didn't take her anger personally. And for so many years I did. I just wasn't ready to not take it personally. And in that moment, I was able and ready to not take it personally. I was able to not take on her dysfunction and make it my own. I was strong enough in that moment to hold my center in the face of all that and to let it pass right through me. I noticed like the first year that I did therapy, I was in a mental health center in the way down south rural parts of Mississippi. And all this dysfunction was pouring through my door. And I would just go home exhausted every day. But after the first year of that, I noticed that everything changed to where I wasn't so tired anymore, but I didn't disconnect. I was actually more connected and more engaged and more in love with whoever I was talking to. But the energy wasn't sticking to me. It was passing through me because I wasn't attaching to it. I was not attached. So when you can be not attached and truly neutral, you need boundaries less and less. So in the interpersonal arena, this is what I call beyond boundaries. Now, there are times when people are trying to pull a dominant, you might call it a power trip or something, and there is some situation that needs to go a certain way. For whatever reason, if you believe you need to stand up for what you think is right, then you might need to set some boundaries to have things go a certain way. Because if you feel a person or group of people is doing things, and this is an internal judgment, and this is so tricky because it's always hard to know what's your ego and what's your good judgment and knowing. Sometimes that's really tricky, and our ego sometimes masks itself as things that we believe in and things that we think is right. So you have to really do a gut check and really know. But if you're standing up for what you know is right, and sometimes having to say no or boundary, or if you know that I'm not ready right now to hold my center in the face of this challenge. I need a boundary right now, because if I don't set a boundary, I'm going to get mean later. I call it nice, nice, nice dragon. Where you be nice, they take advantage of it. You be nice, they take advantage. You be nice, and suddenly you head up to here, and then the dragon comes out.
Yes.
And that's what I call when people do a spiritual bypass.
Mhm.
When we think we're more evolved than we are, and we're trying to be all, nice and perfect and loving and sweet, but really inside we're pissed, or we're feeling hurt, or we're feeling upset.
Yeah.
And suddenly we've let the situation go way too far, and now we're pissed, and now the dragon comes out.
Mhm.
But the dragon's not very functional either, but that's the best you got, then okay.
Yeah.
So boundaries help you pull out of that whole cycle of conflict to where you can have things go a lot healthier for you because of your own limitations, or because there's an external situation that you feel really needs to go a certain way and you're willing to stand up for it.
Yeah.
But when you can do that without attachment, without fear-based thinking, it goes so much better.
Mhm.
And so what I call beyond boundaries in interpersonal relationships is when you know your self-worth is not at stake and you're not worried about, like when mom was coming at me and she was mad at me, she was telling me all the things that she'd ever knew about me when I was a kid. And I was like, I was this and I was that. I just knew that it wasn't about me. And I just knew.
Mhm.
Or like in the ZZ Top story, when that guy was coming at me with his fist, I just knew it was all okay. I didn't need boundaries. I need to hold my center in the moment. And when I did, everything shifted. And this is more of an art than a science. In holding your center, sometimes a boundary will be the right thing to do. Sometimes non-reactivity and holding your center will be the right thing to do. But when you're truly in nothing, your intuition will tell you and you will know.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're in your ego, when you're in your fear-based thinking, you will be muddy and you'll be clouded and you won't know. That's why getting to that place of nothing is so important, because when you're there and you're in your intuition and you're in your higher self as you'll know when you need to set a boundary.
Yes.
Or you'll know when you just need to listen and not be reactive, or you'll know whatever the situation needs to happen.
Mhm.
And boundaries is one important tool along the way in creating healthy relationships.
Mhm.
But I don't want people to think like this is always the right thing to do, because it's not. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Right.
But when you're in your inner knowing, then you will know. That's the trick. When you're fully present and you're responding to the needs of the moment rather than reacting to the ghosts of your past.
Love it. Yeah.
What's happening is we're all reacting to our past programming, our past trauma, and we're not reacting to the needs of the situation. We're just going on automatic pilot with our programming.
Mhm.
What this is about is unplugging from your programming to be fully present in the moment, fully responsive to the needs of the situation.
Mhm.
So I love examples like Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, where they were really holding some really clear boundaries in a very strong way, but they were doing it from love.
Yes.
They weren't doing it from fear.
Yes.
So when you're holding boundaries, are you coming from a place of love or are you coming from a place of fear?
Mhm.
Because if you're coming from a place of fear, it's probably your ego.
Mhm.
And you'll always know by how you feel.
Yeah.
And I just love that speech that Dr. King gave the day before he died. And he said, I may not get to the promised land with you. He knew what was coming, but he was standing up for what he knew was right,
Yeah.
no matter what. That kind of unshakable commitment and
Yeah.
that kind of boundaries about what you stand up for, but doing it in love,
Yeah.
that changes worlds, that changes relationships. So whenever you do need to set a boundary, you want to do a self-check about, am I in fear or am I in love? Because are you setting boundaries for the right reasons? Or are you doing it because you're afraid?
Mhm. Very
So I hope that clarified some of that.
It really does. And circumstances with, well, first of all, the samurai is an example of that Martin Luther King
Yes.
situation, but also if children are involved and there is actually physical abuse or verbal abuse on the like verbal emotional, just like, defaming a child who doesn't have the apparatus yet in place to be able to bear up under that. Sometimes you do need to intercede, but that is from love.
Absolutely.
That is from love,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so, and for ourselves, if somebody is consistently, if we've been the empty vessel for them and we've been giving them the gift of nothing, and they keep coming at us and blaming us over and over and over again, it's not moving through. That's a
Yes.
circumstance I can see myself saying, I'm not going to ratify, like, let them know, like, I'm not going to teach them how to treat me and mine with this poor
Absolutely.
behavior, that we're going to have to actually get intentional about moving some of this stuff through. Even though I've been intentional, they're going to need to get intentional if they want to come to me to be part of it. So those are some circumstances I can think of that would come up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for example, I've had to make that call to human services
Mhm.
hundreds of times probably. but I'm not doing it because I'm mad at the abuser. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do and the kid needs to be protected.
Right.
Or there's so many situations in relationships where it is absolutely time to stand up and set a boundary.
Yeah.
But it's not good for whoever's bullying to get away with that. It's not good for them.
Yes.
And it's not good for the person who's allowing themselves to get picked on. So there's so many times in relationships when I'm talking to people, and there may be one or the other, male or female, who feels like they're victimized by their partner.
Yeah.
When people feel victimized and they've given away their power and they let other people treat them that way, they are just as much responsible for the dynamic as the other person because they're allowing it to continue instead of standing up and setting a boundary and saying, no, this is not right. So setting boundaries is incredibly important.
Yeah.
So when people are thinking about being the empty cup, it's not about letting people do whatever they want to you. It's about freeing your mind from your fear of thinking and letting your intuition guide you. Then you will know whether listening and all those kind of things, or whether it's standing up and saying, no, this is not cool, and here's my boundary.
Yeah.
But it's how you feel. Are you coming from love? And so I don't want people to think this is just the empty cup is just some kind of namby-pamby, oh, let's all get along and be happy kind of thing, because it's not that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you were talking about, being non-attached allows you to be able to hold the empty vessel when there doesn't need to be, when the boundaries are safe and it is okay to hold that.
Absolutely.
And by doing that, it actually, people hear non-attachment and I mean, sometimes I do. And I'm like, well, we need secure attachment. And I don't want somebody just pulling back and being like, as I said before, I don't care. I just let her talk. And then I just went, because their heart's disengaged. It's actually this paradox of non-attaching to the angst and the pain, and instead remembering your divinity and their divinity, and that allows you to actually be bonded in a health, like be together in that beautiful love space without
Absolutely.
having to be attached to the pain and everything. So it's like what we're attaching to. We're naturally attached in our love zones, but
Yeah.
it's making that manifest instead of attaching to the pain and everything else. So I just
Absolutely. When you have healthy boundaries, that makes a relationship work. So romantic relationships by nature is a conditional relationship. You're not going to beat me. You're not going to cheat on me. You're not going to do certain things. There are certain conditions that's inherent in the romantic relationship.
Yeah.
And once you have those boundaries around those conditions, then unconditional love can be expressed.
Yes.
And when you don't have those boundaries, it's just a nightmare where you can't find that love because you're feeling yourself being, taken over all the time. And that's it. That is a setup for disaster.
Yeah.
So having healthy boundaries and embracing the fact that romantic relationships are conditional, but that doesn't mean you can't unconditionally love your partner in the middle of those conditions.
Yeah.
It's just like in parenting, having healthy boundaries for kids is important because kids when they're younger, they just are narcissistic. They just think from their own point of view, they'll mistreat each other, they'll hurt each other, they'll do all kind of horrible things like Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
And when you have healthy boundaries, then safety happens, then unconditional love, then our knowing of our connection can come forward. And that's healthy boundaries is so important in romantic relationships. And I don't think people realize the importance of all that. And there's so many different subtle ways that boundaries or poor boundaries can start to take the relationship off in some really wonky directions.
Yeah. So I want to thank you. The book is tremendous, everybody. It has so much merit and so much utility. And it's something that you can dig into right away and start making substantive changes to yourself, to the world that you perceive, to the world you're creating, to the relationships that you're experiencing and co-creating. It's beyond wonderful. I encourage everybody to get their hands on it. You also have an online course, right?
I do.
Yeah.
And so, so there's an online course, which is my whole therapy process, which is right on the same landing page as the book. And that'll be, we'll talk about core fears, coping strategies, type of comfort, go through a series of videos and online exercises with you and your partner to improve your relationship and basically to go through the therapy process right from wherever you want to be. So that's on there as well.
So wonderful. So Stephen and Liz's website is right below. There's an intro video, which is amazing, on the holding your center process. lots of utility in watching that. Um, and let's see, is there anything I have tremendously enjoyed this. I'm your level of heart and care is just beyond wonderful. I'm in love with it, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you have to say or share to kind of close things out and feel complete.
Sure. So I just want to thank you for being here with me in this conversation. I appreciate the synergy that we've had. I noticed that as we're talking, there's a way that our energy opens each other's energy up. And this is like what happens in relationships when you have that space of clarity, when two people can really be present to each other without emotional baggage, something else happens. And I appreciate you being able to be in that space with me today as well. It's been really wonderful. And thank you so much for what you do. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So many blessings to you, your boys, your wife, everybody that's watching. Thank you all. We'll be in touch and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye.